Welcome, everyone, to episode 5 of the TIMI Talks podcast. This is Nick Marston here with my co-host David Berg. On today's show, we will be joined by Senior Investigator at the TIMI Study Group, Dr. Ben Scirica, to discuss the world of GLP-1 receptor agonists. So, David, when we were brainstorming ideas for this podcast, one of the topics we wanted to cover were the nuances of academic medicine that nobody really teaches you and you kind of just learn on the job. So in that vein, I was hoping we could talk journal decision letters for a minute if we have the time.
Oh yeah, that's a classic topic. What do you have?
Well, I wanted to run one by you just to kind of get your read on it. I always appreciate your input on these things. This is a project I'm doing with a fellow, and when we saw this letter, we were a bit perplexed on how to proceed.
Okay, let's hear it.
All right. Well, I think it starts off pretty standard, something we've all seen before. Thank you for your submission, yada, yada. We regret to inform you it is not acceptable in its present form. So all kind of pretty standard boilerplate stuff. But then the second paragraph caught my attention. It starts with, owing to the amount of work required to address the comments of the reviewers and the editors, we do not encourage revision. So we do not encourage revision. Are they trying to let me down easy? Is this really just a soft rejection letter?
That's funny. That is definitely an interesting twist. I mean, I certainly have been on the receiving end of my fair share of no, thank you, better luck next times. And then, even when journals like it, like whatever you submitted, the initial response usually isn't particularly warm and fuzzy. But that's a true tweener.
Yeah, right.
I don't know what to make of that.
More data needed. So here's how they go on. They say, however, if you feel you can successfully address these comments, we would be willing to process a de novo submission. However, the majority of manuscripts are ultimately rejected.
That is a lot of however.
I know, it starts to kind of feel like a challenge, right? Like they're daring me to resubmit it, which, I think it was my kind of gut instinct when I read this. So how would you advise your team to proceed in this kind of case?
Well, I guess if I were offering dating advice, I might direct you one way. But in this business, I think grit often carries the day. So in the mortal words of Jim Carrey from Dumb and Dumber, I'd say they're saying there's a chance.
I like that. And we're decade removed from dating advice, so I won't take that from you, even if I needed it. But it's a good point about grit, and that's indeed what we did. We just went in and we said, hey, there's a chance still I'm going to make them reject me outright. So we went ahead and resubmitted. So we'll have to see.
Yeah, no, I think, the point about grit is true in life, but especially in academic medicine. So you'll have to keep me posted on how that all plays out. Well, as you said at the beginning, today we are incredibly lucky to be joined by Dr. Ben Scirica. Ben is a cardiologist here at the Brigham. He attends in our cardiac intensive care unit, but also maintains a busy ambulatory practice. And he is a cardiometabolic trialist and really a leader in innovative approaches to healthcare delivery. I know for me personally, he's really been an incredible teacher and mentor going all the way back to residency, and really an incredible resource when it comes to questions about cardiometabolic disease. So let's go ahead and bring Ben on the show.
Welcome to the TIMI Talks podcast, Ben. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
It is great to be with you both.
So, Ben, you've been very involved in leading trials of cardiometabolic interventions in diabetes and obesity, including SAVOR TIMI 53, which was a trial assessing the cardiovascular safety and efficacy of the DPP-4 inhibitor saxagliptin in patients with diabetes. Now, in the case of SAVOR and other trials of new diabetes therapies, I think many of our listeners are aware that the design of SAVOR and these large cardiovascular outcomes trials was driven by a regulatory mandate from the FDA, but others may be less familiar with this story. So could you tell us about that original regulatory mandate in 2008, what it entailed, and perhaps give us a bit of the history that led up to it?
For sure. And, it's a bit of an irony that when I was doing my internal medicine residency, I thought that, I'll never get near endocrinology or anything endocrinology because it's way too complicated. And here I am 15 years later, deep in the cardiometabolic space. But, to take even a step a little bit further back, one of the great successes of 20th century medicine was the development of insulin and really the life-altering treatment in type 1 diabetes. And there's been a quip around for a while that the worst thing that ever happened to type 2 diabetes was type 1 diabetes, in the sense of drug development, because while they share the same name and they both are diseases that have increased glucose, they obviously have entirely different physiologies and pathophysiologies. And for much of the last 50 or 60 years, patients with type 2 diabetes, the primary treatment has always been to optimize their glucose levels and their hemoglobin A1Cs. And there have been, in the type 2 diabetes space over the last decades, really, unfortunately, a graveyard of drugs that have gotten very far in the approval process, and in some cases approved, and then had to be withdrawn from the market or have cardiovascular risk warnings with them. And, that started with some of the early sulfonylureas, and then I think really came to a head in the early 2000s with rosiglitazone and the TZDs. And there was the famous meta-analysis of rosiglitazone that showed it increased the risk of MI compared to placebo. And at that point, there was that combined with several really well done clinical trials that were comparing different intensity and A1C lowering in patients with type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease that showed no benefit of improved glycemic control, and in some cases increased risk of death, really led people to say, what are we doing here? And for cardiologists, I think we sort of thought, the glucose, we're not worrying about that. We're going to focus on high blood pressure, lipid control, antiplatelet therapy, revascularization, and who knows what's going to happen with glucose, but it doesn't seem to matter that much. I think there were other smarter heads in the room that said, glucose is still important in type 2 diabetes. There's clear benefit in terms of microvascular outcomes like nephropathy and retinopathy in particular with better glucose control. And so we have to really identify what are safe drugs to lower glucose in patients with type 2 diabetes. And that led to the regulatory mandate in 2008, which changed how type 2 diabetes drugs were approved, and it required a longer phase 2 and phase 3 studies where A1C was still the primary endpoint, but they had to be in a more diverse population and for longer follow-up. And then it required what was, in a sense, a cardiovascular outcome trial, but to demonstrate cardiovascular safety. And they landed on a non-inferiority margin of 1.3 in that document. And that usually could be done as a post-approval type of study. And within that mandate, then the new classes of diabetes drugs that were just getting introduced, including the DPP-4 inhibitors, the GLP-1 receptor agonist, and the SGLT2 inhibitors, started to undergo this mandatory safety cardiovascular outcome studies.
I mean, so that I think sets the stage very nicely, and so thanks for kind of walking us through that history, Ben. And I guess here we are a decade and a half later, and I think we can all agree that that regulatory mandate really did transform our field. It really transformed the field of cardiology and cardiometabolic medicine. And Ben, you mentioned the DPP-4 inhibitors. Obviously, you were very involved in one of those programs very early, which was studied in the SAVOR trial. But I think what the two real sort of winners, if I can use that term, among the diabetes therapies were the SGLT2 inhibitors and GLP-1 receptor agonists. Because I think, to your point, those cardiovascular outcomes trials, or really safety trials, showed that they were not only safe and well tolerated, but really had clear and robust cardiometabolic benefits. And I think we could spend all day, really, multiple episodes talking about each of these therapies. And in the case of SGLT2 inhibitors, I think there's quite a few twists and turns in that story. But maybe we'll put SGLT2 inhibitors aside for a second and really focus on GLP-1 RAs, which have really been one of the hottest topics in medicine recently. Not just because they're great diabetes drugs, but they've gotten a lot of attention in mainstream media as weight loss drugs. Particularly semaglutide, or Ozempic is as the brand name. There's all kinds of advertisements and certainly get texts from friends about it, and family members about it. So Ben, there have been quite a few GLP-1 RAs that have been tested in cardiovascular outcomes trials, and not all of them have had the same fanfare. Some of them have had different results. Some of the uptake of those therapies has been different. I wonder if you might just sort of walk us through some of the landmark trials in this class of therapies, and maybe highlight some of the ones that are more widely used in clinical practice.
Yeah, the GLP-1 and the SGLT2 inhibitors are clearly the ones that won out of this whole process, and a process that was started to look at safety. Fortunately, found two classes that really have changed how we practice medicine, and because of that, there has been a change in the regulatory landscape. But it has now allowed us to really look at the GLP-1s across a bunch of different studies. And the interesting thing about GLP-1 RAs is they have been developed in different ways, and they do differ a lot between different drugs, not only in terms of what their natural GLP-1 RAs, whether they come from different molecules and different vehicles for delivery, such that they can be shorter acting and long acting. And the first GLP-1 RAs that came out, like lixisenatide, were short acting. They had to be daily injections. We've then moved to the once weekly injections, and the liraglutide was the first GLP-1 RA to report out their CVOT, which was the leader study. And that was in patients with established cardiovascular disease. And it showed a clear reduction in cardiovascular outcomes and MACE events. And there have now been, almost a dozen cardiovascular outcome studies with the GLP-1 RAs. Some are better than others. Some have shown benefit, some have not shown benefit. It's not entirely clear why some are better than others, though it does seem to be that things that maybe are longer lasting and maybe a little bit more potent are more effective in terms of cardiovascular outcomes. But there still is a disconnect. For example, a drug called albigulitide was studied in the Harmony study, and it was actually a relatively modest reduction in A1C and weight, but it showed cardiovascular benefits. And it's not on the market. It was felt not to be commercially viable, but it did show that there is still a disconnect between the A1C and the weight reduction and outcomes. But liraglutide was certainly the first one to show cardiovascular benefits. The next one, duaglutide, is one of the most commonly prescribed drugs right now. It was studied in the REWIND study and showed improvement in cardiovascular outcomes. It tends to be less potent than next generation GLP-1 RAs in terms of A1C reduction and weight loss. And those next generation ones really include drugs like semaglutide. And that was tested in the SUSTAIN-6 study at a dose of 1.0 milligrams. And the dose becomes important as we start talking about some of the other weight loss drugs. And SUSTAIN-6 was a smaller study than some of the earlier cardiovascular outcome trials, but still overall showed a benefit of cardiovascular outcomes. And that was put into the label such that semaglutide, which is at 1.0, which is marketed as Ozempic, has become one of the most prescribed drugs out there in diabetes. There's also an oral semaglutide that is goes under the name Rybelsus, that is a daily dose instead of the once weekly. It had a cardiovascular outcome study called Pioneer 6, which again was about 3,000 or so patients, and demonstrated cardiovascular benefit in a composite outcome, and has been approved for the use in patients with diabetes. So we have this now series of 3 or 4 GLP-1 RAs that have really good evidence in terms of lowering A1C and cardiovascular outcomes that are on the market for patients with diabetes.
Well, thanks for taking us through that, Ben. It's been great to see this data. And I think while these trials were coming out, this was really when cardiologists, of course, started to get interested, and you see those cardiovascular benefits. Certainly, semaglutide seems to be the one that we're hearing most about now. And as David said, we get asked about by our non-medical friends and family members, starting to even rival questions that we get about statins. But now we also have tirzepatide, which is a dual GLP-1 receptor agonist and a glucose-dependent insulinotropic polypeptide, or GIP. And this is generating a lot of buzz as well. We have some head-to-head data there. And so, Ben, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about tirzepatide and maybe summarize some of the key findings from the SURPASS-2 trial or any other relevant trials.
Yeah, I mean, tirzepatide is interesting because it is different from everything else that's on the market right now, because it's this dual GLP-1 RA. And to be honest, it's really hard to understand how adding the glucose-dependent insulinotropic peptide, or GIP, helps. There are other dual or even triple agonists that are in different phases of development. But the short answer on tirzepatide is that the doses that they have been testing have shown really profound effects on A1C reduction in patients with diabetes. And the SURPASS clinical program is the tirzepatide in diabetes program. And they have seen reductions in A1C of over 2% absolute A1C reductions, which is wow. Remarkable. It's sort of almost unseen even with insulin. And weight loss in that group that's been very dramatic. Now, the one important point to think about when we think about the comparisons is tirzepatide has compared itself against other GLP-1 receptor agonists in diabetes, and they've compared themselves in particular against liraglutide and even semaglutide at the 1.0 milligram dose, the diabetes dose, and it is more potent in terms of A1C reduction than those other GLP-1 RAs. I think that'll be important as we start talking a little bit about obesity and the obesity doses of some of the other GLP-1 RAs. But certainly tirzepatide now, which is approved in the US for patients with diabetes, offers some of the most potent A1C reduction out there.
Well, great. I mean, I think you highlighted a couple things that I just want to point out, which is that, the issue of dose. And so it's not just a comparison between different types of agents, but that there's differences in dose that become potentially relevant in terms of understanding their various metabolic benefits and potentially their benefits with respect to reducing cardiovascular outcomes. So it's sort of another clinical trials 101 point, which is getting the dose right for the outcome that you're interested in ends up being very important in terms of interpreting those data. And so I think, to the point that you made, I think there's tirzepatide story is very exciting, but we'll certainly learn more about that in the years ahead. One of the interesting stories about the SGLT2 inhibitors, I know I said we weren't going to go down this road, but I lied a little bit, is that we saw that class evolved from not just being a diabetes drug, but to a therapy that really could benefit patients with heart failure and kidney disease, even in the absence of diabetes. And I think to some extent, we're seeing a parallel phenomenon with the GLP-1 receptor agonists in patients with overweight or obesity. Obviously, those are related diseases, but increasingly those agents are being studied in patients who don't necessarily have diabetes. And that's actually another area where you have a lot of experience, since you're the PI of the Camellia TIMI 61 study, which for our listeners was a placebo-controlled trial assessing the cardiovascular safety and efficacy of lorcaserin, not a GLP-1 RA, but a selective serotonin 2C receptor agonist, specifically in overweight and obese patients. So something that you're very familiar with. Ben, I think it would be great if you could tell us a little bit more about, or maybe outline for our listeners the designs of a couple ongoing trials of semaglutide and tirzepatide, specifically in patients with overweight or obesity.
For sure. I mean, the interesting background again is that in obesity, pharmacotherapy for obesity has been a real frustrating field for decades, with a lot of drugs going totally off the rails and having to get pulled from practice, and it is almost impossible with lifestyle and diet to match the benefit that's seen with bariatric surgery, but the access and utilization of bariatric surgery just makes it impossible that we'll ever be able to treat the number of patients who need to get that type of weight loss. And so when people, I think, started to recognize how potent GLP-1 RAs can be in terms of weight loss, appropriately, they started testing how can we maximize the weight loss effects of these drugs. And the simplest fashion, it's a dose-related mechanism. And what I think has been hard, or the challenge to balance, is that these drugs do have side effects, especially when one starts initiating them. And there is nausea, there's vomiting, there's some GI increases. They're weekly injections. People can feel the symptoms, especially for the first day or two after every injection. Usually that gets better, but it can take 4 to 5, 6 weeks, even longer, to get somebody up to the maximally tolerated dose. And I think when people were looking at diabetes, they weren't as focused on sort of pushing the envelope in that. But now with the focus on obesity, they've done a much more systematic job of trying to find what's the optimal dose for the maximal weight loss. And that's happened both in the semaglutide as well as the tirzepatide programs. And so they have now both been approved as weight loss drugs, which is an entirely different regulatory pathway than diabetes, where weight's obviously the primary endpoint. And they have, and for that, they're, semaglutide is at the 2.4 milligrams, so almost more than twice the original diabetes dose, and is marketed as Wegovy. Tirzepatide decided just to go out of the box, maybe a second out of the gate, seeing what happened to semaglutide, and just sort of did their diabetes and their obesity dosing exactly the same, where they just have it marketed as Mounjaro, and going for the maximum dose. And I think the credit in particular of Novo Nordisk, who is the maker of semaglutide, they decided that they wanted to test semaglutide in a cardiovascular outcome study in patients without diabetes, and that's the SELECT trial. And the SELECT trial is a 17,000 patient study of patients with established cardiovascular disease who are obese and do not have diabetes. It has been enrolling now for several years, and it will be reported out this year. And I think it has the potential, like DAPA-HF and Emperor Preserved, of really redefining the paradigm for the treatment of obesity if it's positive, because it will have jumped the drug from diabetes to a broader population of just obesity. The SURMOUNT MMO trial with tirzepatide is a similarly large cardiovascular outcome study in patients without diabetes for the tirzepatide trial, and it's just started this year. So it's going to be a couple more years before we actually hear the outcomes of SURMOUNT MMO. But hopefully this year, SELECT is going to give us data that will really make us think about how we treat patients with obesity and cardiovascular disease.
Yeah, well, that's really exciting, and we'll have to have you back on to discuss the SELECT results when they do report out. I guess a follow-up question to that would be that the higher semaglutide dose, if it is indeed beneficial and improves weight loss and has significant cardiovascular events, lowering A1C, I guess two questions. One is, would you expect the higher dose to have greater benefits in both A1C and cardiovascular events? And if so, would the company just move to the higher dose overall and want to, you would expect diabetic patients would want to use that higher dose rather than the lower dose?
The company has allowed, or the companies continue to do work on the diabetes dose. And so with somebody with diabetes with Ozempic, you can actually increase to 2.0 milligram now. So it does get people close. And it is clear that as you go up on the dose, you do improve the A1C reduction. The biggest thing, I mean, I think will happen if SELECT does show that there is a benefit of that is honestly sort of on the how do you switch? It's sort of crazy that sometimes you have to switch patients from Ozempic to Wegovy, and one may be covered and one may not be in a particular situation, and it gets caught in a lot of reimbursement issues. So hopefully that'll get simplified if there is consistent data across the different populations.
I see. And that actually segues well to our next question, which is a bit more clinical. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't address two issues that matter a lot to patients. And, certainly approval is another one. But in terms of the rebound weight gain that we've heard so much about when the drug is stopped, and this is not uncommon given the shortages of these drugs, and then also kind of the infamous Ozempic face that we're hearing a lot about in the news. How do you counsel your patients on these issues, and how unique are they compared to other approaches to rapid weight loss?
It's hard because the only place you ever see the rapid weight loss that you see with Mounjaro, tirzepatide, or semaglutide 2.4 is with bariatric surgery. And having now sort of been able to learn from a lot of obesity specialists over time, the things that have come up with Ozempic face is actually things that have come up with a lot of bariatric surgery. That when people lose a lot of weight, they lose a lot of the cushion in their face, and the wrinkles come out, and often having that sort of young looking face is something that people have gotten used to, and now they're 40 pounds less, and it's lost right away. And there are important sort of body imaging considerations that for people who do have dramatic weight loss have to be considered with patients. I think the sort of financial and other thing is that there is pretty clear evidence when you stop these drugs, especially abruptly, people will regain a lot of the weight over the coming months. And I think there has to be a next generation of studies with the GLP-1 RAs in terms of how can we either lower the dose or institute other type of lifestyle changes when somebody is at a good weight while taking a maximum dose that can then continue so that people aren't entirely dependent on pharmaceutical to maintain a healthy weight.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. I think that those are certainly highlight some of the challenges with clinical implementation of this in a sustained way. I guess thinking along those lines about other clinically important questions and returning specifically to patients with diabetes, putting sort of the obese population aside for a second. But that's the question of how do you prioritize between using SGLT2 inhibitors as compared with glucagon, like the GLP-1 receptor agonists. Is there one that you sort of pick first, or how do you sort of think about that? And certainly here at TIMI, I can say we've spent a lot of time thinking about the approach to comprehensive cardiovascular risk profiling of patients with diabetes to potentially better understand which patients are more at risk for adverse heart failure and kidney outcomes, for example, where you might prioritize SGLT2 inhibitors as compared to those who may be more at risk for atherothrombotic complications, where there's clear benefits of both classes. And then obviously there's clear benefits of GLP-1 RAs with respect to kind of metabolic complications, glycemia, weight, et cetera. And so I guess, how do you think about prioritizing one therapy versus the other in your clinical practice?
It's a great question, and comes up multiple times in a clinic. As you mentioned, I mean, there are, I think, some good overreaching ways to look at this. First, I do tend to think about SGLT2 inhibitors in patients who have any degree of kidney dysfunction. And if they have heart failure, certainly heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, but people who have HFpEF as well. The next sort of axis to think about is, I mean, do they want a pill or do they want an injection? And the truth is, I mean, GLP-1 RAs are a really simple little injection. It is a tiny needle with a tiny amount of drug. So it is, from that sense, they generally tend to be very well tolerated by patients. GLP-1 RAs definitely take a little bit more focus in terms of, you gotta titrate them up. So you start at a low dose and then you have to ramp it up over a couple of weeks. So it is a little bit more complicated than SGLT2 inhibitor. But, I certainly do favor GLP-1 RAs when I think that their obesity related issues are large. And whether that is, whether that's because of sleep apnea, whether it's because of musculoskeletal issues, whether it's because restrictive lung function because of weight, where I know that I'll get the cardiovascular and metabolic improvements. But if, honestly, if we can get 10 to 15% of their weight off, they're just going to have a much better quality of life. And I do think that is comes into the way I do present it to patients. And at the end of the day, it's their choice, but that's how I try to frame it for them.
So returning to the research world and trials for a moment, certainly one of the important developments with GLP-1 RAs has been moving beyond diabetes to obesity, as we've talked about. But it's also notable that the landscape of GLP-1 RAs in diabetes continues to evolve. So I wonder if you might give us your perspective on diabetes trials in 2023 and what we might expect to see in the years ahead.
It continues to evolve. I mean, FDA updated its guidance, as you said, where they removed the requirement of a cardiovascular outcome trial. I think in part because the field has moved such that people expect there to be cardiovascular benefit now from a diabetes drug. Why would you give a diabetes drug if it doesn't show cardiovascular benefit, when we have these several classes now that do that? But it does make it a lot harder to do diabetes studies, because you have to figure out what needs to be in the control arm. And people have taken different tasks. For example, the SOUL study is the cardiovascular outcome trial for the oral semaglutide drug, and it's versus placebo. And it's in patients with diabetes and established cardiovascular disease. In contrast, tirzepatide has its cardiovascular outcomes trial in diabetes, which is called the SURPASS CVOT, and it is a active control against duaglutide. Now, both those drugs are made by Lilly, so it's a little bit easier for them to think about transitioning from duaglutide in their portfolio to tirzepatide, but duaglutide is a good drug. So now you have raised the bar in terms of what your investigational drug in this case has to do to demonstrate efficacy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it will be interesting to see how this this field continues to evolve, and I think some of the challenges that were true a decade ago are different than the ones that are true now with respect to trial design and execution in this space. But it really has been, incredibly exciting to sort of see how this has evolved and changed the face of cardiometabolic medicine. And thank you so much. You really have given us an insider look at the GLP-1 RAs. We're truly lucky to have you, not only as an incredible resource here at TIMI, but also to be able to call you a colleague and a friend. So I think I speak for both Nick and myself when I say that you've had a hugely positive impact on both of our early careers. And so for our listeners who might still be kind of early in their training or early phases of their career, I wonder if you have any reflections or general advice that you might be willing to share about your career in cardiovascular clinical research, and sort of ideas to or thoughts about how others might approach their careers, their budding careers in cardiovascular clinical research.
Yeah, so I was a history major in college, and our history minor, and I took the minimum number of science and math classes before, and a couple of years off before I went to med school, and I went to med school obviously because I wanted to treat patients, and I fell in love with cardiology as sort of and cardiac physiology. And it was during med school when I got connected actually with Chris Cannon, who was doing a registry at the Brigham, the National Registry for Myocardial Infarction, and he needed basically a research coordinator, and so I started doing that for him, having never done any clinical trial on clinical research before that. And I was basically in sort of reading charts and filling out at that point papers, CRFs, case report forms. And it was sort of Chris's enthusiasm where he just would have all these questions and start seeing the questions that could be asked through the data that we were collecting. And as I started to learn more about the diseases, started to realize how clinical research could have such a impact. And then during Chris has sort of been a mentor and friend my entire life, and he brought me into TIMI, where in residency, where I started to work on a couple other projects, and then like both of you, in fellowship, then did my dedicated 2 years at TIMI, and I got a master's in public health, where I took basically the exact same stats class that I took in med school. And in med school, I could say I could barely remember a thing from that stats school because I really didn't have any context. And then when I did it again as a master's of public health, after I'd done some clinical research, after I'd done a lot of clinical medicine, I just thought it was the most awesome thing in the world. And was sort of like, this is how to do the methodology here. Now giving this framework to answer the questions was really opened up a huge world. In terms of what I could do as an academic cardiologist. And so that was sort of my evolution into there. The other thing I love about clinical research is that it's a team sport. And the most enjoyable thing about doing clinical research, both at TIMI, but in other areas, is being able to collaborate with such amazing people, not only within our team, like here at TIMI, but across the country and internationally. And to have that network of friends and collaborators really does, who are just as interesting, who push you and push each other in terms of different clinical questions and challenging your assumptions, really is what continues to keep it exciting on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, that's really good advice, to kind of surround yourself with enthusiastic mentors and an enthusiastic team. And I think that enthusiasm is contagious. And so that really breeds a successful research career. Well, thanks so much, Ben, for joining. It's really been a pleasure to have you on the show. And I'm sure we're going to have you back soon to talk about the SELECT trial, among other topics. So we look forward to that.
Great. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Well, that was another amazing guest on TIMI Talks.
Yeah, it really was. And, I think I've heard that topic discussed so many times in the past, but Ben just does it so well and provides such clarity and gives kind of the full spectrum from where this all started to where we are and where we're headed. It's really an exciting field, and a lot of great trials coming up that we'll be able to cover in the years to come.
Yeah, totally. I think I had the same reaction, which is that obviously we're both quite immersed in cardiovascular clinical trials. There's been a lot of discussion about cardiometabolic therapies, and that's not just in our research labs, but that has penetrated clinical practice. But to hear him talk about it was just such a treat. He really has such a deep mastery of this field, and it's always fun when you can hear somebody who can put all of the different studies in context and really kind of appreciate the nuances between the different studies. And I think another point that he made that I really appreciated, and I don't think that we've said this so explicitly before, but the point that he made about clinical research being a team sport is something that totally resonates. I think that is something that drew me to cardiovascular clinical research. And I think that's right. It's the people around you that sort of fuel you and keep you interested and engaged in asking questions.
Yeah, it's true. It's true for all of science, but clinical trials, they're such massive endeavors, and you really need a large and well operating team. And so it's very, very much the case in the work we do. And I think it's a really good point that he made. So I think for fellows and trainees, junior faculty, surrounding yourself with a great team is a really good point that Ben made. So that's episode number 5 in the books for us, David. And we are excited to share that we'll be officially moving beyond the walls of TIMI on our next episode of TIMI Talks.
That's right. So on the next episode, Dr. Bob Harrington, who's the chair of medicine at Stanford and obviously a renowned cardiovascular clinical trialist, will be joining the podcast to record episode 6. And that should also be a real treat. So hope you all tune in for the next episode. And until then, for the TIMI Talks podcast, this is David and Nick signing off.
Thanks for listening. The TIMI Talks podcast is hosted by Dr. David Berg and Dr. Nick Marston and produced by Kate Brennan. Like and follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, and follow us on Twitter @TIMI Study Group to be informed about upcoming episodes.